some of the army that were caught, and they were tied up with rope and shot.
No, you could get killed just as easy one way or the other, but I think the Chinese were better fighters, actually.
You know, they don't call it the Forgotten War for nothing. Nobody remembers Korea.
There was a thought that the North Koreans would just sort of run as soon as they saw a few Americans. That wasn't the case.
It was very, very hot in the summer and extremely cold in the winter.
They charged the U.S. troops en masse, and the children were out in front.
It was a terrible war, and it wasn't a police action, it was a war. Is it a forgotten war? Of course it's a forgotten war.
2 miles between hills where we had troops on, so I mean they could walk right through. It was horrendous.
Korea is an unwon war that never ended, and no one wanted to pronounce it a war so soon after the Second World War. It was the Korean conflict, a police action, and much later, grudgingly, the Forgotten War. But it was death and wounding and heartbreak. The hostility which had festered during the first years of the Cold War burst when the fledgling United Nations acted to prevent the spread of communism into South Korea. The result? Nearly 150,000 UN soldiers died, hundreds of thousands of Chinese, millions of Koreans. In all senses of the word, it was war, the Korean War.
The overriding concern and the growing concern during that period of time was Russia, and a bit of a dismay, as I recall.
What we oppose fundamentally is the aggressive nature of the communist state.
When the defense lines were laid out in the Pacific, the Secretary of State openly declared that Korea was outside of our line of concern and defense. And it's my understanding that this was a sort of a go-ahead signal to the Russians, the Chinese, and this sort of thing. It was open season on Korea, if that's the way to put it.
I joined in April 15, 1948 because of the Soviet threat. It looked like we were going to go to war with the Soviet Union. And as I say, Stalin was trying to take over, was already taking over Europe, the Eastern European countries. And this buddy and I decided we wanted to be where we wanted to be, so we joined the Navy. And because we thought there would be a draft and we'd end up in the Army, and that wasn't what we wanted to do.
Well, I did 2 years in the Navy before the Second World War was officially over. And when I came back, I joined the Marine Reserves unit. Because that was a thing to do. All my friends were there, and it was a good time to get together with the guys, and go have a pitcher of beer after the meeting.
All the guys were joining the Marine Corps because we were getting T-shirts, shoes, pants, and all the stuff, We were proud to be wearing the Marine Corps stuff that they were issuing us.
I was in North Africa. I was drafted, was conscripted in the British Army, and I was there. And I remember I was leaving, getting demobbed, and the officer said to me, "You're lucky you're leaving now because this looks like there's going to be a lot of trouble in Korea." And that's the first time I'd ever heard of the word Korea.
Soon the world heard much more about Korea. At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, communist North Korean tanks and troops roared southward. The invasion across the 38th parallel into the U.S.-backed Republic of Korea was a complete tactical and strategic victory, surprising both troops and civilians.
And the newsreels were showing the refugees trying to cross the Han River Bridge as the North Koreans moved south. And I'll never forget that picture, that image of the refugees on that bridge, trying to scramble over the wreckage of the bridge was demolished.
On the day of the invasion, the few American troops in country were mostly advisors. 2 days later, with United States backing, the UN passed a resolution to defend South Korea. First to enter the fight were the least prepared and the most surprised.
I figure, well, heck, they got real Marines that fight this war, so we'll just go out there and relieve them and take care of the home front while they're gone, you know. It was a nice thought, but it did happen that way. We had a bunch of kids with us. So some of them were barely 16, you know, they'd lied about their age to get in the reserves.
I reported to the skipper, he says, "Welcome aboard, Claeys. Did you hear the good news?" I said, "No, sir." He says, "We're going to Korea." He was happier than hell. And I thought, oh boy.
Nobody ever thought there was going to be another outbreak like the Korean War. We weren't ready. We never thought there was going to be another war.
A lot of people didn't think we ought to be there. I, for one. We all had a different feeling. The whole country did. We were being pulled into something that so unlike the Second World War.
I had not received a draft notice. In those days, once you got your notice, you were in the Army. And she said, "Well, Douglas, we mailed that to you." And I said, "Well, I haven't gotten it." She said, "Well, let me check the file." She pulled open this big file drawer, and there was the envelope sitting on top. She said, "Well, here, I'll give it to you." And I said, No, you mail it." And I jumped in my car and tore into Detroit to the Federal Building, went into the Air Force recruiting office. Sergeant was there. I said, "I'd like to take the exam for aviation cadets."
My brother was killed there on the 17th of October, and I re-enlisted with the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers to go to Korea.
The poorly trained and outfitted Republic of Korea troops were no match for the highly motivated North Koreans. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell into North Korean hands in 2 days. In a month, North Korea controlled 90% of South Korea. The rest was defended by ROK and hastily assembled UN troops, consisting primarily of US and British forces. They made their last stand with their backs to the sea inside the Pusan perimeter. And they held.
You could see and hear all of the bombardment and the artillery and stuff in the mountains, even though it was 20 miles away. You say, if they push us, where are we going to go? How are we going to get off of that part of the peninsula? I had 6 other EM enlisted men to set up the first POW camp in Korea. We were there for the first 3 POWs that came in. They were children.
In mid-September, General Douglas MacArthur ordered an amphibious counter-assault at Incheon.
I was there in time to make the Incheon landing. We were in the belly of an LSD. They just opened the front end of that LSD out in the bay, and we got on the Amtrak and make the landing that way.
We didn't make a landing. We had to go over a wall. One guy jumped over the wall, and he had to pull the other guys with the rifle butt to get over the wall. And then we found out it was the wrong beach. They landed us, so we had to get back in the barge and go back and land us on the right beach.
After 2 weeks of intense fighting, the Marines had retaken Seoul. Communist troops were in full retreat. To the south, UN troops began to counterattack and win. By early October, North Korean troops had been expelled from South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur was determined to push the North Koreans all the way to the Chinese border. China had other ideas. To keep Korea communist, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River in mid-October to enter the war.
They would come in with bugles or their whistles, and they would come in hundreds. You know, they just would come in a big bunch, and we had to keep at it. You know, sometimes it took us 3 to 4 hours to bring one wounded guy or one guy that died back down to where the ambulance was waiting for to take him back.
The 17-day Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, with 20,000 UN troops battling 200,000 Chinese, was one of the most savage in history. It began in late November and was also one of the coldest, with temperatures as low as 35 below zero.
I slept with, as most of the guys slept with all my gear. I slept with my all my stuff in my bag, and it was still frozen. My water was frozen. All my rations were frozen. We fought all the way back to Ham Hung, and we walked and carried our wounded and our dead back. We went up with 200 and some guys, and we came down with 110 or 100 and some guys. We came back.
At Chosin, air power proved crucial to the resupply of troops and the evacuation of the wounded. Air support was a critical element of the entire UN effort. Korea was the first war where the United States used newfangled helicopters and jets.
We had trained in the F-80, which I didn't fit in. It was designed for guys that were 5'6", 5'8", and I was 6'1". But I wasn't going to tell anybody I didn't fit. I wanted to fly fighters so bad. And when I first closed the canopy, I had my head like this, and the canopy was right on top of my head, and I bumped up, and I couldn't see out. Well, okay, there's a little bit of a bump in the canopy, so I'll just duck down, close the canopy, and I couldn't lift my head up.
You're supposed to make 20 okay landings to be qualified. After my 10th landing, came up on a bullhorn and said, "Striking below, pilots qualified." Most of the squadrons were very, very heavy with World War II pilots. They were all full lieutenants.
Pilots and soldiers and medics alike were rushed through training and then quickly sent overseas. In the first 4 months of the war, the U.S. lost nearly 25,000 men. But all these killed, wounded, or captured were replaced.
We departed out of San Francisco, and of course when you go under the Bay Bridge, and that's the last time you're going to see any part of the U.S. for who knows how long.
We were called replacements. I was just a little young recruit, all squared away, my pack, everything was creased. We were replacing guys that had been in combat, and they looked like they needed relief. Their uniforms were tattered, they were tattered looking, and I said, oh my goodness, I'm going to be like this.
We left Okinawa with something like 31 or 32 F-80s from the 2 squadrons, flew to Japan, which at that time was the largest mass flight of jets that ever been in the air. Nobody aborted. Everybody was so glad to get off Okinawa. We'd rather go to combat than stay there.
When we arrived at the airport, a truck picked us up with no cover on it. So going in this truck and then arriving to the 121st Evac, and by the time the truck stopped, some female, must have been a nurse, passed behind our truck with a load of cold beer on her shoulder. So that opened everybody's eyes. They became alert. They were dry, that dusty road. The water was no good, so made it very difficult to get your fluid intake. But I had a heck of a time adjusting from a Southern Baptist to having to get my fluids by way of booze.
Our first mission was with a crew that we were replacing. And there was a fellow on there that was the left gunner, same position I'd be flying in. And after bombs away, he said, "Hey, Farrell, look out here." And I looked down, I said, "What is that?" "This is in the dark. There's a light out there." He said, "It's a MiG." I said, "A MiG?" My heart went right here.
Korea was the first war fought by the United States with units not segregated by race. President Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948.
Things happen, and you don't want to put a race thing on it, but it's definitely a race thing. And yes, my experience was such that I didn't react like a lot of troops react, but I'm only me. I'm not trying to be anything.
For their bravery, many African Americans were awarded medals, including the Medals of Honor. Over 3,000 were killed, tens of thousands wounded. In total, over 100,000 U.S. soldiers were wounded during the war. Many of those would have died without the lessons learned from World War II triage and the care given the wounded on the battlefield by corpsmen and medics. Many were also spared thanks to the use of helicopters to quickly evacuate the severely wounded.
I was in my bunker messing around, and somebody said, "Meek, get some stretcher bearers. The patrol has run into trouble. They're wounded down there, and you got to go down and help them out." So I grabbed my bag and my weapon, and we went running down that hill like we were running the Boston Marathon. And what had happened was that it was there were rocks, and a Marine had stepped on a landmine and blew his leg off about around the knee. And one of my corpsman friends, who had been in training with me at Pendleton, went to do his job to treat him, and he stepped on a mine and blew his leg off. So I had two very, very severely injured people with legs blown off to deal with first, one of them being, a friend. North Koreans were throwing in, mortars and small arm fire and so forth. Fortunately, none of us were wounded at all through all of that, and got the guys up to the top of the hill, and then they back on the back side of the hill so a chopper could come up and pick them up and take them down to the hospital.
They were new to us, but they were very noisy when they would bring patients in from the MASH units to us. So we would all go, everyone went to the hospital, see what you could do. We kept the patients 3 days in this evac hospital. And if we could get them back to duty, we did. If we couldn't, we'd send them over to Tokyo General. And then from there to let them into San Francisco.
They had told me that there was a guy laying out there, but he was pretty badly wounded. As a matter of fact, the corpsman that they were helping out had been wounded trying to help him. And so like I say, I'd seen too many John Wayne movies, and when they told me I shouldn't go down there, well, I have to go down. And so I got to the guy. He was laying in the saddle between the two hills. And when I got there, he says, "Yeah, get out of here," he says. "They're going to kill you. I'm dying," he says. "Just leave me alone." But I got him up, and we started back up the saddle to the hill. And they're shooting at us all this time. He kept blinking around there. And by the grace of God, we didn't get hit again. The guy that I pulled out of him was a replacement. He hadn't been there but maybe a week or so. And I know he was a replacement because their parka was clean.
In its first critical test, the United Nations actually was largely united, the exception being the communist countries. More than 20 nations came to the aid of the South Korean people.
We worked briefly with the Greek unit, with the Turkish unit, and the Ethiopian the Haile Selassie Battalion. Those were tall, silent fellows that had long bayonets that they would keep sharp.
I remember one encounter that we had, and it was with the Turks, where we were firing in support of them. They were very thankful for the support that we gave.
The Aussies, they were always, with their big shoes and, hey, real tough, but they were great. They were good fighters. The British, we heard that they were great in fighting. They're not different just because they're British. They're soldiers too.
We were a brigade guarding a divisional front. We were so spread out. I mean, there was 2 miles between hills where we had troops on, so I mean they could walk right through. It was horrendous, and it went on for 5 days, and then we got caught in a roadblock.
After his capture, Kinne and a large group of other prisoners were marched north to a prison camp. Many died along the way. The brutal trek took over a month.
They were quite free and easy in the kicking and the hitting you with the rifles and things like that, rifle butts. And they'd put you and stand you up in a room and forget to tell you to sit down or stuff like that, or to sit you cross-legged and you wouldn't move, and if you moved there was a guard there to beat you. So it was uncomfortable. I was in the wooden boxes along with a bunch of other guys. I was in those for 81 days, from the 1st of June until the 20th of August. And I know that because it was my brother's birthday, 20th of August. And we said that if one was ever killed, the other one would take his place. So it was something we made, a pact that we made that I kept. And so to do anything other than what I did would have been contrary to my beliefs.
Kinne would spend 838 days in captivity. For his gallantry, he was awarded the British George Cross, akin to our Medal of Honor.
I was very fortunate, I think, in a way that it so happened that people saw what happened to me. Consequently, it was documented, and consequently, I got the award. Now, a lot of people did probably just the same, but nobody saw it.
By 1951, the Korean countryside and its people had been ravaged by the year-long war. Communist allies came to North Korea's aid to carry on the fight. So far, a few thousand Soviets fought, mostly in the air war against UN's superior air power. The Chinese, with hundreds of thousands of frontline troops, made a much deadlier contribution to the war.
The Chinese, when they got into the war, had newer weapons and ammunition, American, than we did. So it was good to capture a hill once in a while so we could replenish our ammunition. You could get killed just as easy one way or the other, but I think the Chinese were better fighters, actually. And if you were going to get captured, you better get captured by the Chinese because they had a little more heart than the North Koreans.
The Chinese had as a tactic the eeriness of the night with the bugle blowing and the yelling and the screaming and that sort of thing, and they felt that that would have an impact more so on us as Americans than perhaps the daylight.
Quite a few times they would attack us at night. At first it was kind of scary, but after a while you got used to it. And all we had to do is shoot them down. Sometimes get right into us and have to use bayonets.
You take 1 million troops, and in that war, in the Korean War, When they didn't have enough weapons to go around, the people without weapons followed until somebody was killed or downed and grabbed that weapon and kept going. They'd call them probes, and they'd make probes, and we'd send up flares and some mortars down and machine guns and so forth.
On April 5th, 1951, the United States ordered the unconscionable. Facing the very real possibility of losing the war, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized the immediate use of nuclear weapons in the event massive numbers of new communist troops should enter the war. Targets in Russia and China were selected. Atomic bombs were sent to Okinawa. But on the front line, in the fog of war, friendly fire accounted for some of the most agonizing casualties.
And he let us have 2 rounds right in the group, and that's what killed most of them. We lost about 6 guys. And here I am, on the next hill, waving my arms, telling them not to shoot. Supposedly, nobody could hear me. and so he turns his gun to me, and I says, and yeah, sure enough, he let go a blast, and it hit below me, about 10 feet, and I hit on my neck and shoulder, dislocated my shoulder.
At one time, I rode tanks over them when we were going up the hill, and they knocked us down the hill. I rolled down about 50 feet down before I get a hold of something. And they killed about 3 or 4 of us.
On July 10th, 1951, peace talks began near the 38th parallel. Suggested by the UN's Soviet representative, the palaver proved fruitless, interminable, and irrelevant to the men fighting and dying on the front lines.
We ran up the hill and passed a foxhole with 3 Marines in there, and we kept on going right into the attacking force. They were just as surprised as I was. See this guy raise his head, look at me, and he wasn't speaking English. So I turned around and went back up the hill and down a little ways to their flank. We're set up and we're keeping them from coming all the way up, because every time I'd see a head pop out, I'd let them have a burst. And then they started lobbing grenades in on us. And one of them fell right by my side, and I picked it up and flung it back. Now, we were close to that foxhole that I had passed coming in there with the 3 Marines on it, and they're the ones that were actually keeping the attack from coming over the hill with grenades, but they ran out of grenades, and they started hollering, "We need grenades, grenades." And they hollered at us, "You got any grenades?" "No," I said, "I don't." And about that time, they threw a grenade at him, the enemy did, and they landed right behind their foxhole. And I hollered, "There's a grenade behind you." And I guess either he thought I had thrown it down there, or he was going to be a hero, so because he turned around and he was looking right at it when it exploded.
Pork Chop Hill, and I think it was Hill 206. And we were firing just automatically as fast as we could go, and shell casings were there as evidence of really an extended and prolonged firefight.
As was said by General Matthew B. Ridgway, who succeeded General MacArthur in April 1951, artillery has been and remains the great killer of communists. Artillery fire in Korea was coordinated by observers positioned with the front-line troops. When bombs and napalm were dropped from planes, that observer was often also a pilot.
When I went up with the infantry, this Lieutenant Colonel briefed me on the duties and so forth. He said, "Lieutenant, that Jeep is not expendable. You are. Don't come back without it." So that was sort of impressed the devil out of me, because those radio jeeps were very, very important. And believe me, when you were with the ground pounders with that jeep, you were king of the hill. They'd do anything for you.
The artillery barrages took their toll on the seemingly innumerable communists, but so did the weather. The brutal cold claimed lives and limbs on both sides of the war.
It was miserably cold. This cold Siberian wind was blowing, and sleet was flying all over the place, and pretty soon it started to snow too. Or maybe it was too cold to snow right away, I don't know. Icicles growing on the bushes and trees, but they were horizontal because the wind was blowing in the direction the wind was blowing. That's the way they were forming. So you can imagine how cold it might have been.
Most of the time it was 20 below, and the snow was up at least 20 feet high. It was pretty cold. We were out in the open. During the night, we'd dig in, and we'd try to dig in, but the earth was frozen. It was hard to dig in.
The winters were frigid, and the summers were just torrid. High humidity, high rain. The falls were beautiful, and in the spring the flowers grew. So it had four almost totally well-defined seasons, and so it was a pretty country.
In the wintertime, it got so cold you wouldn't believe. And one night, about midnight, I had to answer the call of nature. And I get over to the latrine tent, and I just get all situated on the old box, and it was so cold, it made sure I was awake. And just about the time I got all settled, zing, kaboom! I looked out the door. My tent was gone. 120 millimeter mortar or artillery, whatever it was, obliterated the tent that I was in, had been in. About 3 or 4 rounds hit our area. Nobody got hurt, but old Major Drumright got the big surprise. He run outside. He got in his foxhole, and it had some mud in it. But he wasn't worried until Grover Cleveland Alexander Dunlap Jr., big feller, about 340 pounds, come running out of the mess hall, and he dove for foxhole. He landed right on top of the Major Drumright, and splitch, submerged him in the mud. And when he picked him up and brushed the mud off of him, he found the major gold leaf on his helmet. And he says, "Oh, Lordy, he left that place." And they still don't know who submerged the major.
Korea was extremely cold. My Jeep, when I got there, it was idling, and it had been idling for about 3 days. So the Jeep wouldn't move, and they were on a push. So they found a great big rope and tied it around my front bumper and the front end of the rope to tie it around a 6x truck, and they towed me into combat. Here I am sitting in a radio Jeep being towed up there where people are shooting guns at me.
In the second year of the war, combat primarily consisted of probing actions and firefights around outposts set up along the 38th parallel. The front, or main line of resistance, waffled north or south as a consequence of victories or defeats and retreats. The tortuous peace talks remained a virtual stalemate, while troops died on the ground and in the air.
2 times we had to pull back because the people on the right, people on the left had left us up there and pulled back without our knowledge. So we had to pull back and then go back through again.
They reported me killed in Korea twice because we had so many Morenos in the company. And my assistant gunner turned out to be a little guy from Alabama, Charles Ayers was his name, and slow talking, slow moving, but you couldn't detect any fear in him at all, He didn't walk upright and slow, and even when the bullets were flying all over the place, So I don't know if it was him that gave me my courage or what, but We did a pretty good as a team.
Sometimes when they found out there was a lot of Korean soldiers or Chinese soldiers, either one, in some place, and we didn't want to go attack them because we would lose some guys. Better to call in our Marine Corsairs to give us protection. They would come in, and I mean close support. If we were on top of a hill, we almost could put our hands up and touch their crooked wings. You know, we would yell out, "Give them hell, you dirty guys, you know, give them hell, you know, we're proud of you," and all that stuff.
We caught a column of probably at least 100 trucks. It was a lot of trucks, believe me, and a couple of miles long. They caught them where they had on the west side of the road, there was a sheer cliff about 10, 12, 14 feet high. The right side of the road was clear, nothing but farmland, flat for miles. The Chinese were on the hill above them, you know, on the top of that bank. And there was a radio jeep with those troops, with the trucks, that was begging us to strafe the ditch alongside the road. And I wouldn't do it. I told them I'm not going to do it because it's too close to them. We stayed there as long till we ran out of ammunition and fuel. Next day, I flew up the same way, and all these trucks are there, but there wasn't any sign of life anywhere. You just think of all those people down there that with no place to go, no hope, and we couldn't do anything for them except kill as many of the other side as we possibly could before they got killed. So.
It was all frontline close support missions. When I got over the front lines, they started to let us down to hunt for a target of opportunity. And I hadn't gone maybe 15 minutes, and here was this humongous hole. And I looked into that hole, and here were these engines, steam engines, and up and down, chug, 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 moving stuff around. And the reason the hole was there is because the heat from the engines had dissipated that cloud cover. Well, it was like shooting fish in a barrel.
Generally, the worst thing about it, you never knew what you did. You know, they'd call you and say the troops on the hillside there, and you'd strafe and all this kind of stuff, but you didn't know what you did. You don't, when you're close air support, you don't know what's going on. You don't have big guns going off around you. And but if you look back over your shoulder on a overcast day, a dull day, you see hundreds of little flashes where people are firing rifles and machine guns at you. In fact, I had a friend that was hit twice by small arms fire.
Most of the land-based sorties were flown out of nearby Japan. The planes with the most time aloft for combat were those launched from aircraft carriers closer to shore.
Our main function, of course, was sending the jets over to North Korea. I think we had 4 pilots were killed, either coming in or taking off. And we had 4 guys that was on the crew, and one of the choppers came in and caught a crosswind and turned the chopper over, and there was guys standing by the island, and they 4 of them got killed, and a few of them lost limbs and stuff, and we buried them at sea.
We had Big Task Force 77. Our main function was to protect the carriers and the battleships, and the destroyer's main function was, and also to pick up surviving pilots that had to bail out. We'd pick up Air Force pilots, we'd pick up Navy aviators. Most of the time we could see them coming down the parachute. They would eject close to the ship. There's a tradition in the Navy, when you pick up a Navy pilot, they're supposed to trade you ice cream to get the pilot back. And sometimes we get 5 gallons of ice cream, and that didn't go very far with 300 guys, but that was okay.
Naval battles and warfare had played a much bigger role in World War II, and it was those veterans from all branches of the service that played a crucial role in the Korean War.
We had some World War II guys that were older than I was, and I said to myself, if those guys can do it, I'm gonna be right in back of them. I'm gonna survive. If they can do it, I can do it too.
We had 5 officers, 4 of whom were recalled reservists, and picked up and left families, children. Many of them, had been in the service for several years, and at that point had just started careers but were hauled back in now, and many had decided they might stay in because some of them had given as much as 15 or 18 years to the military. And had some had established practices at home, law practices or businesses. These are the guys that really had to be admired. The rest of us were kids, didn't have wives, children, but all these fellows had family and came back in.
Whether they were dodging bullets while building bridges, or slogging through trenches, or flying day after day after day, troops liked to personalize their surroundings.
Jerry's my younger sister. I was assigned this aircraft, 047, and thought, well, I'll just put her name on it. The scarf was, every fighter pilot's got to have a scarf, Started off in World War I, they'd pull it tight to keep the blood from leaving their head. We just did it for effect.
She was originally a nude, and the story where the legend was that the commanding officer of the base's wife didn't like this, and probably some of the chaplains didn't either. And so they came down with an edict and get some clothes on these girls. And he painted earmuffs on her as a bra.
Half a world away, Korea could not have been farther from home for the lonely GIs. Letters and packages from loved ones helped bridge that distance.
My sister wrote a letter to me and said, Mick, that was my nickname, Mickey. They call me Mick. Said, the draft board is looking for you. I said, tell him to come and get me here.
We were always on the move, And by the time the mail caught up with us, it was ancient news. Miguel Romero got some tamales from home, green tamales. Not green corn tamales, but green tamales, because the chile con carne tamales had turned green from the moss growing on them.
My mother was a master baker. She sent me a whole dozen of homemade cinnamon rolls. And when they got there was nothing wrong with them. When I opened the package, somebody says, I smell something. I said, yeah, fellas, I got me a whole dozen of homemade cinnamon rolls. Now, I still got my carbine laying here, and ain't nobody go mobbing. But I'm going to eat one of them all by myself. And I'm going to cut up the rest of them.
The physical and emotional respite from the agonies of war was temporary, but the searing memories are permanent.
I'm going back down there. I don't know if there's any more wounded there. I said, but there's a lot of weapons laying around, and I wouldn't want the Chinese to get them. So I started to form, and nobody followed me, except for Manny Moreno, and he was a short little guy from Nogales, with a BAR, of course. And he said, Vamos, he says, he started going, no, not you. I said, his wife was pregnant, expecting a baby any day. No, you better, no, he says, we're going to show him that Mexicans know how to die here and anywhere else. And he sure showed him Moreno because he got killed. And I felt responsible for that because if I hadn't been so gung-ho to go get those weapons, he might have still been alive. And of course, that was pretty hard to take. I say I cried in Korea twice, and that was one of the times that I cried, losing him.
A lot of them were wounded. I saw POWs with belly wounds, face half shot off, and they were still alive and gasping for air, blood gurgling in their throat. It was very traumatic. But they came in fast and heavy. I really don't know how many was in that camp.
Those left on the battlefield after the last major territorial exchange of the war had to endure nearly 16 more months of fighting and misery and death as the peace talks dragged on. Finally, 2 years and 17 days after the talks had begun, an armistice was signed at the end of July 1953. That ended the war, but not the conflict.
Briefed at 4 in the morning. The armistice was signed, or the truce was signed at 10, and it was to take effect 12 hours later at 10 that night, so they get the word out, I guess, to everybody. And I thought, at 5 o'clock, those guys up at JOC, Joint Office of Command, are going to break for their martini, and that'll be it. So we don't hear by 5 o'clock, we aren't going to go. Well, we didn't. We didn't hear by 5 o'clock. 5:05, the telephone rang, and the message was Scramble 01. That was the first mission that was briefed for the day. So at 5:05, we would go out to aircraft. That was the only time that I actually felt weak in the knees when I went out to the aircraft, and we always did a 360, check everything, pull the pins on the landing gear. As soon as I got into the cockpit, got strapped in, everything was fine. It was just back to, this is the routine of the thing.
A generally thankless nation awaited the returning heroes. Fresh from the battle lines and foxholes and cockpits, they streamed home and began their life anew. The returning vets' arrival was much different from the experience of the World War II veterans.
They just were happy to get home, unloaded troop ships, and everybody was happy to see them, and everybody got a big welcome home. So, very different from Korea.
When I come home, no job. And I went unemployed for 10 months before I could find a job. I think people were sick of war, Oh, you went to Korea, so what? That's what I felt. The attitude was of people that were non-military. I went to dozens of companies apply, and you're too old. Oh, you don't have the experience in this field. I went back to the bottom of the pay line,
And nobody was home. I called from the airport. Nobody was home. They were all working. I got home, and by then my sister had gotten home from work. And she saw the cab, and she rushed out. And the cab driver watched all this, and I turned in to pay him. And he wouldn't take anything. He wouldn't take a tip. He wouldn't take the money. He said, "Merry Christmas, pal." That was our celebration. It was great. Yeah, I'm sorry.
To this day, many try to make sense of the war, what was won, what was lost, and the tepid reception they got back home. Some find solace in the words inscribed on the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. It says, "Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met."
People don't remember. There's no historical background to the fact that we were not attacked in Korea, but we went to help. I know of no great novel written about it, and there's no poetry ever written. There were no songs. There was nothing in the culture side marks the passage of Korea. It was basically over and done with and forgotten.
There's not a big deal made about the Korean War. Maybe because we didn't finish it off. I don't know. I don't know how you would have. I mean, we're still over there.
It's hard to talk to civilians about their experience. But if you met another person that was there, then it'd be easy to talk to him about it. But to people that had never been there, it's hard to really talk about it.
I would say it was a wonderful experience. I never would have known, what it was like had I not had that experience. And I never would have seen the camaraderie anywhere else except there.
It was a terrible war, and it wasn't a police action, it was a war. Is it a forgotten war? Of course it's a forgotten war. It was forgotten when I walked home and people said to me, "Johnny, what are you doing in that uniform?"
It's an experience that I wouldn't go through again, but at the same time, it's one that I wouldn't have missed. It gave me a great insight into human nature.
Everybody thinks about Vietnam, but they don't think about Korea. We lost as many people in Korea as they lost in Vietnam, but the Korean War lasted a little less than 3 years, and the Vietnamese War lasted 10 years, so a little bit of difference. We had one heck of a lot of casualties.
They can call it whatever they want. I think it was a war, and that's it. A lot of guys were dying and getting wounded, and they can call it the forgotten war or the conflict, but it was a war, that's it.
I'm proud of what we did, and we did it, and I think the words at the Korean Memorial spell that out. Freedom is not free, and we went to the help of a country that needed it.
He never volunteered much. It was we'd always have to ask. He always could turn it around and make it funny. The stories about his imprisonment in the prisoner of war camps, but nothing too serious when I was growing up. As I got older, he got a bit more serious when my brother and I would ask questions, and I think we had more insight into what he went through as a POW. And I think we asked more probing questions the older we got. It's like, "Dad, please write it down," and he hasn't done it yet. And I'm afraid that if he doesn't do that, it's going to be lost. The story will be lost, and my children and my grandchildren aren't really going to get to know, what a great man he was. It has to come out over time. And I think that you have to start talking early about it. And a lot of these men, they're not going to brag. They're just not like that. But it's unbelievable. You can't believe some of the things that he went through. He never said that he didn't want to talk about it. He'd always answer. But I don't think we ever got the full story, all the emotion behind what he went through. It has to be literally hundreds of conversations to get out the story and to get an idea of what happened and the depth of what they felt.
That event has permeated his every being. We as children or partners or wives and husbands need to be more in tune or more aware and work together as a unit to understand what's happened. It's only until more recently where he's been able to kind of express himself and truly let himself come out in terms of the war. I would say to definitely take the time to ask what happened and to kind of delve more into the emotional aspects. There's so much that you see in combat and people dying, and it's important to be able to verbalize that and be able to express yourself and your emotions and what's happened to you and how your life has been affected. Time's limited as they're getting older and we're getting older, that it's really important to make that effort.
When we go out with any of the guys, they always talked with their hands, and
You know, a jet pilot can't talk without using those hands. All of those boys and women that lost their lives and were injured over there, and they all have stories. That's part of our history. They should know that history and that their grandfather and father was over there and doing those things.
Spence has said very, very little about the Korean War. He does not like to talk about it. But with several classes, he has taken 1 hour and given them a slideshow and explained as he went along what the slides depicted and what was happening at the time, just so this group of youngsters will know that it happened and how horrible it was.
Learn more about Unforgettable, the Korean War online at pbs.org. Unforgettable, the Korean War is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call us at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
These are some of the hard-fighting Marines cut off by the communists. In the sub-zero weather, they make camp, knowing they will not be abandoned to a relentless foe. A mighty force of B-29 bombers pound enemy key positions in round-the-clock raids that stall communist supply lines. Awaiting an agreement between the opposing forces, the Allied troops maintain a constant alert on the ground, in the air, and at sea.